December 15th, 1859, St. Bartholomew's Chapel, outside Natchez, Mississippi. A date forever seared into the memory of the American South as the night when holy ground became unholy grave. Seraphina, that was the name of the woman who, dressed in white silk and bound by chains invisible to the congregation, chose fire over submission and turned a wedding altar into a funeral pyre. A house slave, 19 years old, born and raised on Magnolia Grove Plantation, trained to serve with a smile, to bow with grace, and to accept whatever fate white hands decided for her. But that December night, Seraphina did not bow. She did not accept. She did not obey. Seraphina burned. With the same matches she had lit for evening prayer candles, she ignited the sanctuary where they tried to sell her soul in the name of holy matrimony. What began as a forced wedding ceremony filled with hymns and false blessings turned into an inferno of rebellion, righteousness, and retribution. In less than 20 minutes, the chapel and everyone inside were reduced to ash and screaming memory. Seraphina wasn't driven by madness. She was driven by the knowledge that some chains can only be broken by fire, freedom denied, silence imposed, and the name Marcus, the man they promised she could marry but sold away to sugar plantations in Louisiana, where death came quick and mercy never came at all. This is the true story of Seraphina, a slave who decided that December would not be a night of holy union, but of righteous destruction. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. While the town of Natchez glowed with Christmas lanterns, the slave quarters trembled with whispered prayers. The moon hung high over Mississippi, cold and sharp, like a blade too bright to hide. Across the countryside, windows flickered with candlelight. Fireplaces warmed parlors decorated with holly and ribbon. Children dreamed of Christmas morning behind warm blankets, while their mothers prepared feast tables with crystal and silver. It was December 15th, 1859, a night of carols and celebration, of polished boots and pressed white collars. But at Magnolia Grove Plantation, the air carried a different weight. There the cold crept through wooden slats like fingers searching for warmth that would never come. The smell wasn't roasted goose or spiced cider, but old fear and fresh desperation. The only light burned dim in the big house, not enough to chase away shadows, only enough to see them dance. Seraphina sat in the small room behind the kitchen, staring at the white dress hanging from a wooden peg. It looked like something beautiful. From a distance, silk and lace, pearl buttons climbing up the back like tiny moons. But up close, it was a shroud, a costume for a performance she never auditioned for, a costume that would transform her from person to property in the eyes of God and law. She touched the fabric once, felt its coldness against her palm, then pulled her hand away like she'd been burned. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear of what was coming, from rage at what had already been taken. Marcus's face floated in her memory like smoke. His laugh, warm as summer thunder, now silenced by distance and chains heavier than any she'd ever worn. His promises, whispered in the darkness behind the smokehouse, promises of a real wedding someday, of children who would grow up free, of love that wouldn't need permission from white men with ledger books and cold hearts. But Marcus was gone, sold 3 months ago to pay for Master Caldwell's gambling debts, shipped south to Louisiana sugar fields where slaves lasted 2 seasons if they were lucky. She'd tried to send word, tried to learn if he was still breathing, but the plantation swallowed information like it swallowed people, completely and without trace. Earlier that day, she had helped prepare the chapel. St. Bartholomew's stood at the edge of the plantation, a small wooden building with tall windows, and a bell tower that reached toward heaven like an accusation. Master Caldwell had built it 10 years ago, not out of piety, but out of pride, a monument to his own righteousness, where he could marry off his human property with the blessing of God and the approval of his neighbors. Serafina had scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, arranged flowers picked from the winter garden, lit candles in brass holders that reflected light like trapped stars. Her hands moved through the motions while her mind calculated distances, counted exits, memorized the placement of every lamp and candle. The wedding was Master Caldwell's idea, born from economics disguised as morality. The groom, Thomas, was a field slave from the neighboring riverside plantation, chosen not for love or compatibility, but for his strong back and the debt his master owed Caldwell for seed cotton. The marriage would seal the deal, create valuable breeding stock, and demonstrate Caldwell's Christian charity to the watching community. 2 birds, 1 stone, 2 lives destroyed with 1 ceremony. Back in the quarters, an old woman named Patience watched Serafina with eyes that had seen too much history. "You mighty quiet tonight, child," she murmured, her voice like wind through dried leaves. Serafina didn't turn from the window where she stared at the chapel's dark silhouette. "Quiet don't mean empty," she whispered back. Patience nodded slowly. "Wedding night ain't no night for spirits to be restless." Finally, Serafina looked at her, eyes bright with unshed tears and unspoken fury. "That's why they need to be." The wind pushed against the cabin walls, rattling loose boards like skeleton fingers. Behind Serafina, tucked beneath her thin mattress, lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth, kitchen matches, a vial of lamp oil stolen from the big house, and a prayer that had nothing to do with forgiveness. Tomorrow the newspapers would call it arson. The courts would call it demonic possession. But tonight it was justice wrapped in white silk, waiting for the right moment to strike the match that would light the way to freedom or death, whichever came first. Because while Natchez slept in comfortable ignorance, Serafina was preparing for a different kind of ceremony, one where she would be both bride and executioner, victim and avenger, the lamb who chose to become the wolf. Before the fire, before the screams, before the night that would burn her name into Mississippi legend, there had been love. Real love, not the manufactured affection of arranged breeding, but the kind that grows wild in stolen moments between sunset and darkness. Serafina remembered the first time she saw Marcus, walking across the field with shoulders that refused to bow despite 20 years of carrying other men's burdens. His skin was dark as Mississippi soil, rich and strong, and his eyes held something she'd never seen in a slave's face before. Hope that hadn't been beaten out of him yet. He was new to Magnolia Grove, purchased from an estate sale in Vicksburg, where his previous master had died of consumption, leaving debts that could only be paid in human flesh. Marcus came with a reputation as a hard worker who caused no trouble, a description that usually meant a man's spirit had been broken early and thoroughly. But Serafina saw something different in the way he moved, a coiled energy that suggested the breaking had never quite taken hold. Their first conversation happened by accident, or what passed for accident in a world where every moment was planned by others. Serafina was drawing water from the well behind the kitchen when Marcus approached with empty buckets, moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned that hesitation invited attention from overseers with whips and short tempers. He nodded, politely, waited his turn, and when she handed him the rope, their fingers touched for just a moment. "Thank you, miss," he said quietly, his voice carrying the musical cadence of someone who had grown up closer to New Orleans than Memphis. She should have nodded and walked away, should have kept her eyes down and her thoughts to herself, but something in his tone made her look up and meet his gaze directly. In that moment, she saw her own longing reflected back at her, the desperate hunger for connection that plantation life tried so hard to crush. "Serafina," she whispered, offering her name like a gift. "Marcus," he replied, and suddenly the small space between the well and the kitchen felt like the most private place in the world. They stood there for a heartbeat longer than safe, drinking, in the sight of each other, memorizing details against future loneliness. Then footsteps echoed from the big house and reality crashed back down like a fist. For weeks, they found excuses to cross paths. Marcus would linger near the kitchen when he delivered vegetables from the garden. Serafina would take longer than necessary to hang laundry on the line that ran past the quarters where he slept. They spoke in glances and careful words, building a language that overseers couldn't interpret and masters couldn't forbid. When words became too dangerous, they communicated through touch, a brush of fingers when passing a water dipper, a hand resting on a shoulder during Sunday prayer meeting, small rebellions that felt as large as revolutions. The first time Marcus kissed her, it was behind the smokehouse on a night when clouds covered the moon, and the overseer was drunk on corn whiskey in his cabin. She had been hanging herbs to dry when he appeared beside her, like a shadow given form. Neither spoke. Words would have broken the spell that seemed to protect them from discovery. He cupped her face in hands made rough by cotton and cane, and when their lips met, Serafina tasted freedom for the first time in her life. Not the abstract concept of legal manumission, but the immediate reality of choosing something for herself, of existing in a moment that belonged entirely to her. They began to dream together, whispering plans in the darkness between work and dawn. Marcus spoke of Canada, of cities where black men walked free and earned wages for their labor. Serafina shared stories her grandmother had told about maroon communities in the deep swamps, places where escaped slaves built their own towns and lived by their own laws. Neither plan was realistic. They both knew the odds of successful escape, knew the dogs and guns and professional slave catchers who made running away a form of elaborate suicide. But the dreams kept them alive when everything else tried to kill their spirits. One evening in September, as they sat hidden in the tall grass beyond the cotton fields, Marcus took her hand and spoke words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Someday," he said, voice thick with conviction, "someday we're going to stand up in front of God and say our vows proper." not because some white man told us to, but because we choose to. You and me, Serafina. You and me forever." She believed him because she had to, because faith was the only currency they had that couldn't be taken away by force. 3 weeks later, Master Caldwell sold Marcus to pay off a poker debt to a Louisiana planter known for working slaves to death in his sugar mills. No warning, no goodbye. Just a name scratched from the plantation inventory and a space in Serafina's heart that would never heal. She learned of the sale from Patience, who had overheard the transaction being discussed in the big house over brandy and cigars. "They got a good price for him," Patience said gently, trying to soften the blow. "Said he was prime breeding stock." Serafina didn't cry when she heard. She walked to the smokehouse where they had shared their first kiss, pressed her forehead against the rough wood, and made a promise that burned hotter than tears. If she couldn't have the wedding Marcus had dreamed of, she would make sure no one else would either. If love was impossible, then love's mockery would burn like the lie it was. The marriage contract had been signed in ink and bound in law, but it was written in blood and sealed with tears. Thomas, the man chosen to be her husband, was not cruel by nature, merely broken by circumstance. 25 years old, field worker since childhood, a man who had learned to find what small pleasures he could in a life designed to provide none. He approached Serafina 3 days before the wedding, hat in hand, eyes fixed on the ground between his feet. "I know you don't want this," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of shared understanding. "I know you loved somebody else, but maybe we can make it bearable. Maybe we can find some kindness in it." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not an enemy but another victim of the same system that had stolen Marcus from her arms. Thomas had kind eyes and gentle hands, and under different circumstances, they might have found friendship, if not love. But kindness wasn't enough to heal the wound that Marcus's absence had carved in her soul. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and meant it. "I'm sorry for what's going to happen." He didn't understand then, but he would remember those words later when the flames reached the ceiling and the screams began. The wedding dress arrived on a cold morning in December, delivered by Master Caldwell's daughter, Eleanor, who prided herself on her Christian charity toward the plantation's human property. Eleanor supervised as Serafina tried on the gown, making adjustments with pins and measuring tape, chattering about the beauty of Christian marriage and the joy of serving God through obedience to his natural order. The dress fit perfectly, transforming Serafina into a vision of pure bridal beauty that would make the ceremony appear blessed and proper to the white families who would attend. "You look lovely, dear," Eleanor said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Thomas is very fortunate to have such a beautiful bride, and you're fortunate to have a master who cares enough about your spiritual welfare to provide a proper Christian wedding." Serafina nodded and smiled, playing the role of grateful slave bride while her mind catalogued the number of oil lamps in the chapel, the distance between pews and exit doors, the amount of time it would take for flames to spread from curtains to wooden beams. That night, she walked to the chapel alone, moving through shadows that seemed to welcome her like old friends. The building stood empty, waiting for tomorrow's ceremony, moonlight streaming through tall windows to illuminate the altar where she would stand in white silk and speak vows that meant nothing. She tried the door and found it unlocked. Master Caldwell's Christian trust in his neighbors and property alike. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and dried flowers, of hymn books and lamp oil, all the elements needed for worship or destruction. She walked slowly down the aisle, her bare feet silent on floorboards that would soon be kindling. At the altar, she knelt and closed her eyes, not in prayer, but in preparation. Tomorrow this place would burn, and she with it, if necessary. Freedom or death, love or ashes, but never again the chains disguised as holy matrimony. The matchbox rattled softly in her pocket as she rose and walked back toward the door, each step a promise and a threat. As she reached the threshold, she turned back once more to look at the altar where Marcus would never stand beside her, where love would never be spoken, where justice would finally be served, burning hot and bright as the fire that would consume it all. The morning of December 15th rose gray and cold, Mississippi winter settling over Magnolia Grove like a shroud woven from mist and dread. Serafina woke before dawn, not from sleep, but from the half-conscious vigilance that had replaced rest since Marcus disappeared into Louisiana sugar fields 3 months before. Her small room behind the kitchen felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in like the sides of a coffin, the air thick with the weight of what was coming. She rose and washed with water from a chipped basin, her movements deliberate and calm. Today was her wedding day, the day she would put on white silk and stand before God and witnesses to speak lies with her mouth while truth burned like acid in her throat. But it was also something else, something the white folks gathering for the ceremony couldn't imagine. It was her judgment day, the day when Serafina the slave would cease to exist, and something else would take her place. The dress hung waiting, beautiful and terrible as a funeral shroud. Eleanor Caldwell had outdone herself, transforming simple silk into something that belonged in a Natchez mansion parlor rather than a plantation slave wedding. Pearl buttons caught the weak morning, light like tiny stars, and the lace trim spoke of delicate hands and expensive materials. It was a costume designed to make the forced marriage look like choice, to dress brutality in the language of romance and blessing. As Serafina lifted the dress from its peg, she felt the weight of the small bundle sewn into the hem, matches, wrapped in oiled cloth, a vial of lamp oil disguised as perfume, and a strip of cotton fabric that would catch fire like it was born for burning. Her fingers found the hidden supplies and pressed them through the silk, reassurance that she wasn't walking naked into her own destruction. Patience entered without knocking, carrying a tray of cornbread and coffee that would serve as wedding breakfast. The old woman's eyes were red-rimmed with unshed tears, and her hands shook as she set the tray on the small wooden table. "Child," she whispered, voice breaking like twigs under frost, "you don't have to do this. There's other ways. There's always other ways." Serafina turned from the dress to face the woman who had been more mother than the one sold away when Serafina was 5. "What other ways, Patience? Run to the swamp and get torn apart by dogs? Poison myself with nightshade and cheat them of their wedding show? Smile and pretend and let them use my body to breed more slaves for their cotton fields?" Her voice remained level, but fire flickered behind her eyes like lightning in storm clouds. "At least you'd be alive," Patience pleaded, reaching out to touch Serafina's arm. Dead folks can't change nothing. Dead folks can't love nobody. That boy of yours wouldn't want you throwing your life away for pride." "This isn't about pride," Serafina replied, gently removing Patience's hand but holding it between both of hers. "This is about truth, about saying no when nobody expects it, about showing them that some things can't be bought and sold and dressed up pretty with white lace." She squeezed the older woman's fingers once, then released them. "Marcus is probably dead already in those sugar fields. If I'm going to join him, I want to go out standing up instead of lying down." Patience wept then, quiet tears that fell like rain on dry earth. She had seen too many young people destroyed by the plantation system, watched as hope was beaten out of them one lash at a time until they learned to smile while bleeding inside. But she had never seen anything like the light in Serafina's eyes, bright and terrible as a comet racing toward Earth. By mid-morning, the chapel filled with witnesses, white families from neighboring plantations, dressed in their Sunday finest and chattering about the beauty of Christian charity toward the lesser races. They brought children who fidgeted in uncomfortable clothes and slaves who stood silent against the walls, eyes down, hands folded, playing their assigned roles in the theater of Southern civilization. Master Caldwell held court near the altar, accepting congratulations on his benevolence while his wife distributed program cards printed with Bible verses about marriage and obedience. Thomas arrived wearing the good clothes provided by his master. Dark wool suit that hung loose on his field-hardened frame, white shirt stiff with starch, shoes that pinched his feet but looked proper to white eyes. He stood at the altar with hands clasped behind his back, face a mask of resignation mixed with something that might have been hope. Perhaps he believed they could find happiness together, could build something real from the ashes of their stolen dreams. Perhaps he had convinced himself that love could grow in soil, watered with tears and fertilized with broken promises. The minister, Reverend Patterson from Natchez Presbyterian, opened his leather-bound Bible and smiled benevolently at the assembled crowd. He was a small man with a large voice, famous for sermons that praised the divine wisdom of slavery, while encouraging masters to treat their property with Christian kindness. He had performed dozens of slave weddings over the years, always emphasizing the blessed nature of holy matrimony, while carefully avoiding any mention of the legal reality that slave marriages carried no protection under law and could be dissolved by sale at any moment. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice echoing off wooden walls that would soon echo with screams. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God and this company to witness the holy union of Thomas and Serafina in Christian matrimony." His words became background noise to the pounding of Serafina's heart, the rush of blood in her ears that sounded like distant thunder or approaching cavalry. She stood at the back of the chapel, waiting for her entrance cue, the white dress, transforming her into an angel of vengeance disguised as a blushing bride. Through the open doors she could see the gray December sky, heavy with clouds that promised snow before nightfall. Somewhere beyond those clouds, Marcus might be looking at the same sky if he was still alive to look at anything. Somewhere in the sugarcane fields of Louisiana, his bones might already be enriching soil that would grow next year's crop. Another casualty in the endless arithmetic of human suffering that kept the plantation system profitable. "The bride may now enter," Reverend Patterson announced. and every head turned toward the back of the chapel where Seraphina stood framed in the doorway like a vision from Scripture. She took her first step down the aisle, then another, moving with the grace of someone walking toward her own execution or her own liberation. In her case, the same thing. The congregation murmured approval at her beauty, at Master Caldwell's generosity in providing such finery for a slave wedding, at the touching display of Christian civilization triumphing over African barbarism. They saw what they expected to see: grateful slave, benevolent master, the natural order of God's creation, playing out according to divine plan. They did not see the matches sewn into her hem, the oil disguised as perfume, the fire that burned behind her smile like the promise of apocalypse. Halfway down the aisle, Seraphina's eyes met Thomas's, and she saw understanding dawn in his face like sunrise over a battlefield. He saw past the white silk and pearl buttons to the woman beneath, saw the determination that would not bend, and the love that could not be replaced. In that moment, he knew she had meant every word of her apology, knew that whatever was about to happen would burn them both. But it was too late to stop now. Too late for him to run or for her to change her mind. The congregation watched expectantly. The minister waited with open Bible, and the altar beckoned like a sacrificial stone hungry for blood and fire. Seraphina took another step, then another, each footfall bringing her closer to the moment when she would choose between the chains they offered and the flames she carried. The matchbox pressed against her leg through the silk, warm and promising as a lover's touch, and she smiled as she walked toward Thomas, toward the altar, toward the moment when St. Bartholomew's Chapel would learn the difference between holy matrimony and righteous destruction. The altar stood like a throne of lies, carved from Mississippi oak and polished to a shine that reflected candlelight, like captured souls. Reverend Patterson waited with his Bible open to Ephesians, ready to read about wives submitting to husbands while carefully ignoring the verses about husbands loving wives as Christ loved the church. The white congregation leaned forward in their pews, eager to witness this display of Christian charity that would let them feel righteous about their participation in human bondage. Seraphina reached the front of the chapel and turned to face Thomas, her hand steady as stone despite the inferno building in her chest. He looked at her with eyes that held too much understanding, too much resignation, too much acceptance of a fate neither of them had chosen. She wanted to tell him to run, to grab his hat and bolt through the nearest door, to save himself from what was coming. But words would shatter the careful performance that kept the white folks smiling and unsuspecting. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Patterson intoned, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had never questioned the divine rightness of his own privilege. "We are gathered here in the sight of God and this Christian community to join Thomas and Seraphina in holy matrimony, a blessed union that reflects the natural order established by our Heavenly Father." His words washed over the congregation like honey over poison, sweet on the surface but deadly underneath. Master Caldwell beamed from the front pew, his wife dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as if witnessing something beautiful rather than the legal sale of human breeding rights disguised as religious ceremony. Their daughter Eleanor glowed with pride at her role in providing the wedding dress, convinced she had performed a genuine act of Christian kindness rather than costuming a tragedy in silk and pearls. Marriage, the Reverend continued, is an institution ordained by God for the continuation of his divine plan, a sacred bond between man and woman that brings order to the natural passions and ensures the proper raising of children in Christian households. Each word fell like a whip crack on Seraphina's soul, but she remained still as a statue, face arranged in the expression of grateful submission that white folks expected from their human property. Behind the mask, her mind worked with clockwork, precision, cataloging exits and obstacles, calculating how long the oil would need to soak into wooden pews before the flames could catch and spread. The chapel held perhaps 60 people, packed tight in celebration of their own righteousness. The main door stood open to let in December air, but the windows were narrow and high, designed more for light than ventilation. Once the fire started, there would be panic, crushing, confusion. Exactly what she needed to ensure that justice burned as hot and complete as her own immolated love. "Do you, Thomas?" Reverend Patterson asked, turning to the groom with practiced solemnity. "Take Seraphina to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer and poorer, till death do you part?" The irony of the question, asking a slave to make vows about ownership while being owned, about choice while having none, seemed lost on everyone except the two people standing at the altar. Thomas looked at Seraphina one more time, and in his eyes she saw not just understanding but forgiveness. He knew what she was about to do, knew he would burn with the rest, but he understood why it had to happen. "I do," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than any wedding vow because they meant not just acceptance of marriage but acceptance of martyrdom. "Do you, Seraphina?" The Reverend turned to her, his smile benevolent and condescending. "Take Thomas to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold, to love, honor, and obey, in sickness and in health, for richer and poorer, till death do you part." The congregation held its breath, waiting for the words that would seal the transaction, transform two human beings into breeding stock with legal blessing and divine approval. Seraphina opened her mouth as if to speak the expected words, then closed it again. She looked out over the crowd of white faces, satisfied and smug in their certainty of righteousness, then at the slaves standing along the walls with heads bowed and spirits broken. She thought of Marcus somewhere in Louisiana sugar fields, probably dead, but maybe still breathing, still hoping, still believing in the love they had shared behind the smokehouse in stolen moments between sunset and dawn. "I do," she said finally, but her voice carried something that made the minister frown slightly, made Master Caldwell lean forward in his pew, made Thomas close his eyes as if preparing for impact. The words themselves were correct, but the tone suggested something else entirely. Not submission, but promise. Not acceptance, but threat. "By the power vested in me by God and the state of Mississippi," Reverend Patterson declared, raising his right hand in blessing, "I now pronounce you husband and wife in the eyes of the Lord. Thomas, you may kiss your bride." The congregation erupted in polite applause. Handkerchiefs fluttered, and children clapped their hands at the pretty lady in the white dress. Thomas stepped forward hesitantly, knowing this kiss would be their first and last, knowing it would taste of goodbye rather than hello. As his lips touched hers, Seraphina tasted tears, His, hers, the salt of sorrow that had been building for months like flood water behind a weakening dam. For just a moment she let herself imagine what their life might have been like under different circumstances, whether they could have found happiness together and freedom, whether their children could have grown up with names instead of prices. Then, the kiss ended and reality crashed back like a fist to the stomach. The congregation rose for the recessional, ready to follow the happy couple outside for photographs and congratulations before returning to their own plantations and their own comfortable certainties about the divine rightness of human bondage. Someone began playing Amazing Grace on a small pump organ, the hymn about redemption and salvation floating over heads that would soon be screaming in flame and terror. Serafina reached into the hidden pocket sewn into her dress, fingers finding the vial of lamp oil and the matches wrapped in oiled cloth. The time had come to choose between the life they offered her and the death she would claim for herself. Between the chains disguised as holy matrimony and the fire that would burn away every lie they had told about love and God and the natural order of creation. She smiled at Thomas one more time, mouthed the word forgive where only he could see, then let her hand close around the matches like they were Marcus's fingers intertwined with hers in the darkness behind the smokehouse. The congregation waited expectantly for the bride and groom to process down the aisle, ready to shower them with rice and rose petals and false blessings. Instead, Serafina pulled out the vial of lamp oil and began pouring it over her white silk dress, the clear liquid soaking into fabric that would burn like it was born for the purpose. The congregation gasped, confused by this deviation from the expected script, unsure whether they were witnessing madness or theater, or something else entirely. Serafina! Master Caldwell rose from his pew, face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. What in God's name are you doing? She looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no submission, no recognition of his authority over her body or soul. I'm getting married, she said calmly, striking the first match against the rough wooden altar, to the only man I ever loved. The match flared bright in the chapel's dim light, and for a moment everyone froze, hypnotized by the small flame that would soon become an inferno. Then Serafina touched it to her oil-soaked dress, and St. Bartholomew's Chapel learned the difference between holy fire and unholy burning, between divine judgment and human justice, between the wedding they had planned and the funeral they would receive. The silk caught fire like it had been waiting all its life for this moment, flames racing up the fabric with eager hunger. Serafina stood perfectly still as the fire embraced her, arms spread like wings, face raised toward heaven, with an expression of ecstasy that was terrible and beautiful to witness. The congregation screamed and surged toward the doors, but she was already moving, already spreading the fire to altar cloth and wooden pews, to hymn books and window curtains, to everything that had participated in the lie of her forced marriage. Run, she whispered to Thomas, but he stood frozen beside her, unable to abandon the woman who had chosen death over dishonor, fire over chains, truth over the comfortable lies that kept the plantation system profitable. Run! She shouted this time, pushing him toward the nearest window as flames began to lick at the chapel's wooden walls. The fire spread with supernatural speed, as if the building itself wanted to burn, wanted to purge itself of all the false ceremonies. and lying vows that had been spoken within its walls. Smoke filled the air, thick and black, turning daylight to twilight and heaven to hell. People trampled each other in their rush for the exits, white folks and slaves alike reduced to animal panic by the democratic terror of flame that recognized no difference in skin color or social station. Seraphina stood in the center of the inferno, no longer a slave bride but something else entirely, an angel of vengeance, a prophet of fire, a woman who had chosen to burn rather than break. The flames that consumed her dress revealed the truth beneath the silk costume, showed the world what happened when love was forbidden and hope was bought and sold like sugar or cotton or human flesh. Through the smoke and chaos, she thought she saw Marcus standing in the doorway, arms outstretched to welcome her home. Whether vision or hallucination, or the first glimpse of whatever came after death, she didn't care. She walked toward him through the flames, leaving behind the name Seraphina and the life that had never been hers to live, stepping into fire, and freedom and the promise of love that no master could buy or sell or destroy. Behind her, St. Bartholomew's Chapel burned like the lie it had always been, taking with it the pretense of Christian charity and divine order that had dressed human bondage in the language of Scripture and salvation. The bride in chains had become the bride in flames, and her wedding fire would burn in Mississippi memory long after the ashes cooled and the bodies were buried, and the comfortable lies began again. The chapel burned like Scripture made flesh, like revelation written in smoke and screaming. Within minutes, the wooden walls became pillars of fire reaching toward heaven, with prayers made of crackling timber and melting glass. The flames moved with purpose, racing along oil-soaked pews, leaping from hymnal to hymnal like they were reading the words and finding them wanting, consuming everything that had participated in the ceremony of sanctified slavery. Seraphina stood at the heart of the inferno, her white dress transformed into a robe of living flame that made her look like some terrible angel descended from the Old Testament to deliver judgment with fire and sword. The silk had burned away completely now, but the fire clung to her skin like a lover's embrace, like Marcus's arms around her in the darkness behind the smokehouse when the world was young and love seemed possible. The congregation became a mob, civilization stripped away by the democracy of terror that made no distinction between master and slave when death wore wings of flame. Master Caldwell pushed through the crowd toward the main door, his wife clinging to his arm and sobbing as their daughter Eleanor screamed for help that would not come. The slaves pressed against the walls tried to reach the windows, but the glass was too high and too small, and the crush of bodies made movement impossible. Reverend Patterson clutched his Bible to his chest as flames licked at his Sunday coat, the leather binding beginning to curl and smoke as if the Word of God itself was rejecting the lies spoken in its name. "Lord, have mercy," he cried, but his prayers were swallowed by the roar of hungry fire that had found more sustenance in hypocrisy than in any communion wafer. Thomas had not run, despite Seraphina's pleas, despite the flames reaching for him with grasping fingers. He remained beside the altar where they had spoken vows that meant nothing to law, but everything to truth. His good suit smoldered. His face streamed with sweat and tears, but he would not abandon the woman who had chosen fire over chains, death over dishonor, love over the lies that dressed cruelty in silk and Scripture. "Seraphina!" he called through the smoke, reaching toward her through curtains of flame. "I understand. I forgive you. I would have chosen the same." His words carried across the chaos like a prayer finally reaching heaven, like absolution granted by the only authority that mattered, another soul who knew the weight of chains and the price of freedom. She turned toward his voice, her face serene despite the inferno that surrounded them both. Through the fire and smoke, she smiled at him with an expression of perfect peace, perfect clarity, perfect love that had been purified by flame until only truth remained. "Tell them," she whispered, knowing he could not hear but trusting that somehow the words would reach him. "Tell them what love looks like when it chooses itself." The roof began to collapse, massive wooden beams falling like the judgment of God upon the congregation that had gathered to witness the marriage of property to property disguised as holy matrimony. Chunks of burning timber crashed into pews, where white families had sat in comfortable certainty of their own righteousness, where they had watched human beings promise to love and honor, while knowing those promises could be broken by sale at any moment. Outside, those who had escaped the flames stood in the December cold, watching St. Bartholomew's Chapel consume itself like a sacrifice offered on the altar of truth. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stared in shock at the destruction of their carefully ordered world where God and slavery danced together in perfect harmony. They had come to witness a wedding and instead received a revelation written in flame and blood. The fire department from Natchez arrived too late, their horse-drawn engines useless against flames that seemed to burn with supernatural hunger. The volunteer firemen could only watch as the building collapsed in on itself, taking with it the altar where lies had been blessed, the pews where hypocrites had sat in judgment, the windows that had looked out on cotton fields watered with tears and fertilized with broken dreams. As the walls fell inward, some witnesses swore they saw two figures standing hand in hand in the heart of the fire, a woman in flames like a dress made of light, and a man who had chosen to die beside her rather than live in the world that had tried to buy and sell their love. Whether vision or reality, whether imagination or divine revelation, the image burned itself into memory deeper than any scar, more permanent than any law. Others claimed they heard singing through the roar of flames, not the screams of the dying, but the sound of voices raised in harmony, singing spirituals about freedom and deliverance, about rivers to cross and promised lands beyond the reach of masters and overseers. The melody rose above the crash of falling timber and the crack of superheated stone, carried on smoke toward stars that looked down on Mississippi with ancient eyes that had seen slavery rise and would someday see it fall. When dawn broke over the ashes of St. Bartholomew's Chapel, nothing remained but blackened stone foundations and twisted metal that had once been church bells and organ pipes. The wooden structure had burned so completely that investigators could barely determine where the altar had stood, where the pews had been arranged, where the door had opened onto a world that would never be quite the same. 37 people died in the fire, their bodies burned beyond recognition, their identities lost in the democratic embrace of flame that cared nothing for the color of skin or the content of bank accounts. Master Caldwell and his family perished along with their slaves, Reverend Patterson alongside the congregation he had served, white children and black adults reduced to ash and memory by fire that judged only the content of hearts. The newspapers. called it a tragedy, an act of savage madness that proved the necessity of strict control over the slave population. They wrote about Seraphina as a demon in white silk, a creature of pure evil who had destroyed innocent lives in service to her own selfish desires. They did not mention Marcus, did not speak of love forbidden and hope destroyed, did not ask, what drove a woman to choose fire over forced marriage to a stranger? But in the slave quarters, a different story spread like smoke on the wind. They spoke of Seraphina not as demon, but as saint, not as destroyer, but as liberator, who had chosen to burn rather than break, to die standing up rather than live kneeling down. Her name became a whisper of resistance, a promise that some chains could only be broken by fire, that some lies could only be answered with flame. The chapel was never rebuilt. The land where it stood remained empty, growing wild with weeds and brambles that seemed to thrive in soil enriched by ash and rebellion. Local people claimed the ground was cursed, that strange lights danced there on December nights, that the sound of singing could be heard when the wind was right, not hymns of submission but songs of freedom, voices raised in defiance of every chain that had ever bound the human spirit. Years passed, and the Civil War came to Mississippi like fire to dry timber, burning away the old order and leaving behind ashes from which something new might grow. When Union soldiers marched through Natchez in 1863, some claimed they saw a woman in white walking beside their columns, her dress glowing like flame, her eyes bright with the promise of liberation. Whether ghost or vision or simply hope given form, she marched with them toward a future where love would not need permission and marriages would be made by choice rather than force. The bride in chains had become the bride in flames, and her fire burned on in the hearts of everyone who had ever loved in secret, who had ever chosen truth over comfort, who had ever looked at injustice and decided that some things were worth burning for. Her wedding dress had been silk and lace, but her real garment was flame, and fire, once kindled, could never be fully extinguished. In the end, Seraphina had gotten her wedding after all, not to Thomas, who died beside her in love and understanding, but to the fire that had courted her since the day Marcus was sold away, to the flame that had whispered promises of freedom in the darkness of forced servitude, to the inferno that welcomed her with arms of light and heat and the promise that love, once true, could never be bought or sold or destroyed by any master's whip or any preacher's lies. The fire spread beyond the chapel, beyond the plantation, beyond Mississippi itself, carried in the stories of those who witnessed or heard tell of the bride who chose burning over breaking. It flickered in the eyes of other enslaved women who dared to dream of choice, glowed in the hearts of abolitionists who saw in Seraphina's sacrifice a prophecy of the conflagration that would someday consume the entire system of human bondage. 1870, when the 15th Amendment granted voting rights to black men throughout the United States, old-timers in Natchez would gather on courthouse steps and porch swings to tell the story of the wedding fire, their voices dropping to whispers when they spoke her name. Some claimed she had been crazy, others that she was a saint, but all agreed that December 15, 1859, had changed something fundamental in the air they breathed, the water they drank, the soil where their cotton grew. The children and grandchildren of slaves who had witnessed the fire carried the story north during Reconstruction, weaving it into the great tapestry of resistance that had sustained their people through centuries of bondage. In Chicago and Detroit, in New York and Philadelphia, Black congregations would tell the tale of Serafina as part of their oral history, a reminder that freedom had always been claimed by those brave enough to pay its price. White historians, uncomfortable with a narrative that cast a slave woman as avenging angel rather than victim, tried to erase the story from official records. They spoke of the chapel fire as an unfortunate accident, a tragedy caused by faulty heating or electrical malfunction, anything but deliberate rebellion by someone they had bought and sold like livestock. But memory has its own authority, and stories rooted in truth have a way of surviving attempts at burial. In the 1960s, as another generation of Black Americans fought for freedom and dignity, civil rights workers rediscovered Serafina's story in the testimony of elderly residents whose grandparents had lived through slavery. They adopted her as a patron saint of resistance, her image appearing on posters and pamphlets that proclaimed freedom by any means necessary, and we shall not be moved. Her fire had become their fire. Her refusal to accept chains had become their refusal to accept segregation. The site where St. Bartholomew's Chapel once stood remained empty well into the 20th century, the land too haunted by memory for development, too charged with significance for casual use. Urban legends grew around the vacant lot. Teenagers dared each other to walk across it on December nights, claiming they could see the outline of the building in the moonlight, hear the echo of wedding vows spoken in flame rather than fear. In Dapper, 1959, exactly 100 years after the fire, a group of civil rights activists attempted to hold a memorial service on the site, only to find themselves surrounded by Ku Klux Klan members determined to prevent any commemoration of slave rebellion. The confrontation escalated into violence that left 3 people hospitalized and dozens arrested, proving that Serafina's fire still burned hot enough to ignite passion a century after her death. The memorial service was eventually held in a Black church in downtown Natchez, where hundreds gathered to honor the woman who had chosen love over law, freedom over force, truth over the comfortable lies that dressed oppression in silk and scripture. They sang the spirituals that witnesses claim to have heard rising from the flames, their voices carrying across the Mississippi River toward Louisiana, where Marcus had disappeared into sugar fields and maybe, just maybe, still lived in the memory of cane workers who knew that love could survive even death. A wreath of white roses was placed on the site where the chapel altar had stood, the flowers glowing like small flames in the darkness. By morning, the roses had vanished, taken by souvenir hunters, blown away by winter wind, or perhaps claimed by a bride who had finally received the wedding gifts denied to her in life. The mystery remained unsolved, like so much of Serafina's story, but those who had placed the wreath reported feeling a presence in the darkness, a warmth that had nothing to do with December weather. As the civil rights movement gained momentum through the 1960s, Serafina's story spread beyond the Black community, reaching white liberals who struggled to understand how their ancestors had participated in such systematic cruelty. College students wrote papers about her, comparing her rebellion to the EU, Boston Tea Party, and other celebrated acts of American resistance. The difference, of course, was that she had rebelled against American injustice rather than British taxation, making her story more complex and uncomfortable, for a nation still wrestling with the legacy of slavery. Feminist scholars of the 1970s claim Serafina as an early example of women's refusal to accept male control over their bodies and choices. They pointed to her rejection of forced marriage as a precursor to the battle for reproductive rights, her willingness to die rather than submit as evidence that the spirit of resistance had always burned in women's hearts. Academic conferences debated her motivations, her methods, her meaning for contemporary struggles for gender equality. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Serafina came not from historians or activists, but from the brides themselves, black women who, given the legal right to marry whomever they chose, spoke her name as they walked down church aisles toward futures of their own making. They carried white flowers in honor of the dress she had worn, lit candles for the fire she had chosen, promised to love and honor while remembering the woman who had died rather than speak such words as lie. In wedding ceremonies across America, ministers who knew the story would sometimes pause during the vows, allowing a moment of silence for those who had been denied the right to choose their own partners, who had loved in secret and died without recognition. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but in that silence lived the memory of a woman who had transformed her wedding dress into wings of flame, her marriage altar into a funeral pyre, her forced ceremony into a choice that echoed through generations. The bride in chains had become the bride eternal, her story woven into the DNA of American resistance. Her fire passed from mother to daughter like a sacred flame that could illuminate any darkness. She had wanted only to marry the man she loved, to speak vows that meant something beyond property transfer, to build a life based on choice rather than force. Denied that simple human desire, she had chosen something larger, to become a symbol, a warning, a promise that love would always find a way to survive, even if it had to burn down the world to do so. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the fire she lit on December 15, 1859, still burns in every heart that refuses to accept injustice, in every soul that chooses truth over comfort, in every spirit that knows that some chains can only be broken by flame. The chapel is gone. The plantation is ruins. The masters are dust. But Serafina's fire burns on, waiting for the next bride who will need its light, the next lover who will require its heat, the next rebel who will choose freedom over safety, and truth over all the pretty lies that dress oppression in silk and call it divine will. She had worn white silk to her wedding, but she had dressed in flame for her freedom, and fire, once kindled in the name of love, can never be extinguished by any force on earth or in heaven. The bride in chains had become the bride in flames, and her fire would burn until every chain was broken, every lie exposed, every love set free to choose its own destiny, in a world where silk was just fabric and marriage was just a promise between souls who had finally learned to see each other as human. If this story burned something inside you, it's because her flame was never meant to die. If you carry in your blood the memory of those who chose fire over chains, love over law, truth over the comfortable lies that make injustice bearable, then you carry Serafina's fire. Subscribe, share, and keep her flame alive for the next generation, who will need its light to find their way to freedom.